So, like I said, it's been on my mind to do this video for quite some time. I keep putting it off, and I feel disobedient, so I'm gonna do it now. I'll try not to play the whole entire video, but I will leave it in the description box so you can go and watch it for yourself without me in the background constantly cutting in. So, fair use again. So, I'm gonna play this video, and I'm probably gonna do a part two, because I don't want to make this one too long, where I show you Edward Griffin, this G. Edward Griffin, break down socialism, and because a lot of it, when he goes step by step in explaining the definitions for all this applied to today, a lot of this video here applies to us today, and you can see how they tried to use this on us and it wasn't successful, but they're being successful with that whole alphabet rainbow. No, you can't even call it a rainbow, because right, with a rainbow there's 7 color spectrums, right, to a rainbow. What they've done is they've used 6, right? Think about it: 666, the mark of the beast, or the mark of man, right? The number of man. The throne of Satan. Where's the throne of Satan? It's in Sweden, according to the book of Revelation, because he tells you who this man, this one man that was murdered at the throne of Satan. So when you look up where he was murdered, it's in Switzerland. You think about it, that guy that was in a coma for all those years, comes out of a coma, and what language he could speak? Swedish. Just saying. But no, but yeah, the homosexual movement, right? With all the letters that they keep adding to their movement, they are the successful tool of the communists to bring about socialism, and you'll see.
For recommendations for resources they could use to do their own research. We did do a ton of research in the making of Uncle Tom 2. We read all kinds of books. We dove through all kinds of archives and footage. And I remember, as I was learning more and more about the civil rights movement and how steeped it was in Marxism, I was just amazed that nobody else has, to that point, put out a film that shows this side of American history, of the civil rights movement. That is, until I came across a film called Anarchy USA, which was written and directed by G. Edward Griffin in 1966. When I watched it, I just had a feeling of shock and relief. Shock because here you had a film that basically showed a lot of the same things that I myself have come across in my own research, and relief that I'm not the only one talking about it. In fact, that G. Edward Griffin was talking about it well before I was even born. So that was cool to see, because it helped me to understand that there's a lot of people who know full well what the civil rights movement was all about. So consider this resource to be the first of several videos that we will release over the next few weeks in our audience's quest for truth. So without further ado, I present to you Anarchy USA.
And I want to keep this in mind. He says this was communism and the effect it had on the civil rights movement. Remember, communism is Zionism. Zionism's first attempts failed in Europe. Karl Marx, whose real name is Mordecai Marx, right? He switched his name from Mordecai Marx to Karl Marx as he failed in promoting Zionism along with other Zionists, and then repackaged Zionism as communism. So when they're talking about communism, remember, this is Zionism. All this is the goal of Zionism coming true. So when they conclude that communism is really socialism, it's all those things but the original name, the origin of it, right, the roots of it all, or the seed, right, the seed of it all is Zionism.
Listen, see, we, the Negro people down here have gotten completely fed up, and you know what they gonna do tonight? They don't care. They not gonna fight down here no more. You know where they going? They after the white people. Now they after the white people. They gonna congregate. They gonna caravan out in Inglewood, Playa Del Rey, and everywhere else the white man's supposed to stay. They gonna do the white man in tonight, and I'm gonna wait. No.
Anarchy, the breakdown of law and order, a chaotic reign of terror, mob rule and rioting, the collapse of government authority. These phrases ring strange in the ears of Americans, and for good reason. Through the years, America has stood as the world symbol for law and order. Our government is responsive to the will of the people. Our courts and legislatures provide the mechanics for a peaceful redress of grievances. And the policeman on the corner has traditionally been looked upon as a friend, not as the instrument of a tyrant. Anarchy, well, that was something we read about in our newspapers that was always happening in other countries. Perhaps the people in other countries had just reasons to riot against their governments. After all, many of the nations of the world are dictatorships in one form or another. What business was it of ours, anyway? Newsworthy, perhaps, but it could never happen here. Then, in the summer of 1964, widespread rioting and looting suddenly broke out in Harlem, in Rochester, in Newark, in Jersey City, in Philadelphia, Cleveland, and Chicago, all within a few days of each other. It was as though an unseen hand had given the signal. Then, on August 18th, 1965, guns replaced nightsticks in the hands of law enforcement officers as the Watts area of Los Angeles literally burst into a cauldron of insurrection. Thousands of rioters roamed the streets both night and day, smashing and looting, and setting the torch to over 50 square miles of the city. Hidden snipers held police and firefighters at bay as fires raged unabated. At least 35 Americans died in the violence and gunfire. The sheer magnitude of this monstrous madness strained the abilities of the civil authorities, and the California National Guard was sent to Watts with orders to quell the violence with brute force.
Now, I want you to remember how you described the riots and the looting taking place, because we've seen that, right, in our day and age with the Black Lives Matter protests, right, and the rioting that went on. And we know that people kept pointing out that the protest would start off peaceful, and then people would come in there, right, with their own agenda, looking to use this to loot places and rob places, right? And there's a gentleman that did a video that shows the places that they hit were purposely targeted, because as soon as they were done and the protests were over, the banks claimed these places, and now these places are being torn down, and come to find out they're a part of the rebuilding is a part of the whole 15-minute cities, that these locations were purposely chosen to help with the infrastructure they want to build for these 15-minute cities. So just keep that in mind, keep this in mind when I show the video.
If necessary. The spectacle of American soldiers shooting it out with American civilians was even more shocking than the rioting itself. The nation was stunned and horrified. No smugness now. This time it wasn't a foreign country. This time it was Anarchy USA. The degree of communist influence in these riots has been subject of much discussion and controversy. For a solution to this controversy, let's review the events of recent years, both at home and abroad, in light of the communists' own plans for world conquest.
The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can only be attained by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions.
The most powerful enemy can be conquered only by exerting the utmost effort, and by thoroughly, carefully, attentively, and skillfully taking advantage of even the smallest rift, of every antagonism of interest among the various groups or types within the various countries.
Divide the people.
And just think about that, right? That's where you see with every time you turn around, it's always something, right? You've always got the promotion of racism whenever there's a chance, like the whole brawl that just took place down in Mississippi at that the shoreline there, where basically this melanated man just got jumped by 7 I don't even know what to call them nowadays, right? Caucasian people for simply doing his job and making sure the boat was clear, so the commercial boat that had the people that paid for their dinner on a boat could park at the dock. He got jumped for that, and then next thing you know, you hear everybody, oh, it was a race riot. It was a race riot. No, it wasn't. It was, man got jumped, and I hope he sues every last one of them and gets a good settlement for it, because I mean his job is not worth being beat up by entitled people, and but you have feminism, right? That and their whole thing that they're always it's always men have found a way to oppress women at every turn, from not letting them vote, which when you actually understand the whole voting system back in that time, okay, there was a reason why, and it wasn't because they didn't like women. It was the responsibility of the men that worked, and so it's a lot. You see it all the time, so it all adds up. Oh, so you're if you do one thing, oh, you're a racist. You do another thing, oh, you're a misogynist. Oh, you do something, oh, you're against homosexual people. And the list can go on and on. You're an environmental terrorist if you drive a car, and that's not battery operated, even though the power plant that's serving the power so they can charge the car is fueled by coal, which they tried to shut down all these coal mines. So they have all these different ways to make sure you're always in a division with somebody.
Split them into quarreling factions, fighting among themselves rather than their common enemy. This is the comrades' first rule for the conquest of any country, for well do they know from long experience that the nation so divided and weakened can be easily conquered from within. For Mao Zedong, finding the point upon which to divide the people of China and create a revolution was comparatively simple. The Chinese for centuries had been principally tillers of the soil, eking a meager livelihood from land they did not always own and for which they paid tribute to landlords who generally...
Whoa, what did he say? They did not always own that land? But you're the Chinese, right? I mean, all these emperors, the Yellow Emperor, all that, right? You're supposed to always have been there. How could you be on a land that you did not always own? And you're paying landlords? And that was how they got you to uprise? Who were their landlords? That's the next question, right? Who was the landlords that owned the land that the Chinese people were just farming for? Think about that. I wasn't expecting that when I first watched this video, but that stuck out.
They had large holdings. Strong backs and legs were requisite to survival for the great masses who provided the power for China's limited and primitive industry and agrarian economy. A new regime promised reforms, but the communists were not interested in reform. They were dedicated to revolution. Because of the dissension and sabotage created by the insurrectionists and the reticence of some of the landlords and merchants to change the established traditions, the reforms were slow in coming. And so the rich and well-to-do were inclined to stay rich and well-to-do, and the lot of the poor fared only slightly better. And a minority of the Chinese peasants accepted the idea so subtly planted and avidly nurtured by the communist leaders. The so-called enemy of the people had been identified. It was the landlord.
The Catholic Church.
He was the cause of the misery and injustice. And so the point of division for the Chinese people was established. In Cuba, a land accustomed to crisis in government and the decrees of dictators, Fulgencio Batista headed a regime that was the least tyrannical Cuba had known for several decades. Rising levels of education, culture, industry, and commerce were enabling the people to enjoy the highest standards of living in all Latin and South America. Corruption in government there was, but no more than was to be found in many cities in the United States. Fidel Castro, a young, well-trained communist revolutionary with much experience, seized upon the issue of corruption in government as he undertook the creation of his revolution. It was the government, said Castro. The government was responsible for the problems and oppression felt by the people. It was the dictator and his followers. It was the Batistianos. They were the enemy. In Cuba, as in all countries, there were the poor and the poorly educated who labored in the fields. Castro promised agrarian reform, which focused the discontent of the rural community upon the latifundista. They, too, were the enemy. And so the communists, experts at fomenting discontent, began to split the population into quarreling factions, setting Cuban against Cuban. Algeria is a creation of the French. Before the French came to the land now known as Algeria, it was nothing more than a conglomerate of warring tribes. Their constant fighting among themselves for the best pasture land each spring and the best barley land each autumn kept the native population of the area at about 1,500,000 for 14 centuries. Today, after little more than 100 years of French rule, the population of Algeria stands at about 9 million. Under French dominion, the Algerian nation grew and prospered. The two cultures of Islam and Christianity were working together to create a good life. In the early 1930s, the dissident voice of the communist was heard among the people. At first it whispered, "The Algerian nation is not France, cannot be France, and does not wish to be France. Independence is the natural right of all peoples." As the seeds of disunity began to germinate, the dissident voice was heard more loudly to proclaim, "Islam is my religion. Arabic is my language. Algeria is my fatherland." And so, too, in Algeria, were the issues that were to divide the people clearly defined. It was to be Muslim against Christian, Arab against European, Algeria against France. The enemy was personified as the Colon. With phase one, that of dividing the population, completed, the revolutionists were ready to move into phase two of the communist blueprint for takeover. Create the appearance of popular support. In every country now part of the Red Slave Empire, the actual number of Communist Party members at the time of takeover has been less than 1% of the total population. As Lenin phrased it,
communism must be built with non-communist hands.
by cleverly beguiling thousands of well-intentioned people into unwittingly supporting the revolutionary program, the dedicated 1% can trick the 99% into surrendering their birthright. This they do by hiding the true communist objectives behind appealing slogans and pretended humanitarian goals. As Stalin explained,
the revolutionary accepts reform in order to use it as a cover for his illegal work.
in China, the propaganda mills were active in championing Mao's agrarian reform. The propagandists portrayed in vivid detail the hardships and injustices of the Chinese peasant. The communists popularized the slogan, "Land to the tiller." Mao Zedong exclaimed, "We are not striving for the social and political communism of Russia. Rather, we prefer to think of what we are doing as something Lincoln fought for in the Civil War, the liberation of slaves." In the United States, Those books which praised Mao Zedong as non-communist and an agrarian reformer were advocated reading, and some even became book club selections. It was later revealed that many of the pro-communist books and articles were written and reviewed in this country by communists. The American people, unaware of the treachery, were conditioned to accept the enslavement of China's millions. Cubans rallied round the slogan, Patria o Muerte. But perhaps the most widely used slogan was the one later to be used in Haiti and Venezuela, and still later in English in the United States. Venceremos. We shall overcome. Early in the revolution, Fidel Castro sought to reassure the people of the true nature of the uprising. I have said very clearly that we are not communists. Our revolution is a humanistic one. The press of the world sang the praises of Fidel Castro. Many eulogized him as the savior of Cuba. In the United States, Castro was referred to as the Robin Hood of the Sierra Maestra, that he pursued the same policy of taking from the rich and giving to the poor. The nation's press was quick to report, "This is not a communist revolution in any sense of the word, and there are no communists in position of control. The only power worth considering in Cuba is in the hands of Premier Castro, who is not only not communist, but decidedly anti-communist." And so the Cubans and the Americans and the rest of the world were reassured that there was no infidel in Fidel. In Algeria, more land was owned by Muslims than was owned by the Europeans. Yet the propagandists claimed that the poor Muslims were being oppressed by the wealthy European landowners. The call was for Muslim unity. It was oppression, colonial oppression, the Muslims were to fight. It was to be a holy war in God's cause. The insurrectionists declared that Algerians were an oppressed people living under a tyrannical colonial government, and therefore their revolt was a war of liberation. Since all Algerians held full French citizenship, both Muslim and Christian majorities regarded the idea of liberation as ridiculous. Ahmed Ben Bella, leader of the revolutionists, and 4 companions were arrested by the French and confined as political prisoners. Ben Bella later escaped to Cairo, where he and others set about the task of convincing France, the world, and the Algerians that Algeria needed to be liberated. Then started a systematic reign of terror designed to intimidate the Muslims into going along with the liberation movement. This book was published by the French army in an attempt to alert the free peoples of the world as to the true methods employed by the communist-led insurrectionists. The atrocities shown here were perpetrated upon the Muslims by Ben Bella's rebels parading under the banner of the National Liberation Front, or FLN.
And we've seen them use the same tactic in our lifetime, right? So we're bringing the people of Afghanistan freedom, and Iraq freedom after, the whole thing was, we're looking for weapons of mass destruction, right? Which they knew there were none. They still have never found any. The claim is they were moved into Iran, and now look at the people over there, right? They're so free, except like when you look into, what has the United States done for Iraq, for example? Well, they teach LGBTQ stuff, and they give them all that money for that. Like they even tried that with, what was it? One of the nations in Africa. They just tried that recently. They promised to give them $60 million if they taught LGBT, whatever that is, ideology. And the country is like, no, we're not taking your money. We're fine without it. And they're like, oh, well, we won't allow any tourists to come here anymore. You know, like, you think the only nation that tours our country is homosexuals from America? You know, like, you know, just the arrogance, you know. It was but we've seen it our entire lifetime. I mean, and then what was it? The thing that they did right away was they allowed pornography and sex workers to be legalized in Iraq, which was never allowed. And they were like, even the local police of Iraq can't even stop them or touch them because they're protected by the armies. So that's the freedom that they give them.
Men, women, and even children came under this merciless scourge in the name of freedom. We would never have brought these documents to the notice of public opinion had the torturers not chosen to depict themselves as victims, had the criminals not been transmuted into accusers. And that is exactly the way it appeared to the world. The French army was accused of police brutality. The godless revolutionaries were depicted as liberators. The insurrection was described as a popular and spontaneous uprising of the people. So effective was the programming of this big lie that some of the world's leading citizens were led to give aid and comfort to the enemy that plans to conquer the world.
I am today introducing a resolution which I believe outlines the best hopes for peace and settlement in Algeria. It urges in brief that the President and the Secretary of State be strongly encouraged to place the influence of the United States behind efforts either through the North Atlantic Treaty Organization or through the good offices of the Prime Minister of Tunisia, Sultan of Morocco, to establish the basis for a settlement of an independent personality of Algeria, interdependent with France and the neighboring nations. I believe this to be of vital importance to us.
This photo was taken October 15, 1962 in Washington, D.C. and carried the following caption: Premier Ahmed Ben Bella of Algeria and President Kennedy stand as Ben Bella receives full military honors shortly after his arrival today for talks with the chief executive. Ben Bella is expected to thank Kennedy for having called for Algerian independence as far back as 1957. After receiving full military honors at the White House, Ben Bella visited fellow revolutionary Fidel Castro before returning to Algeria. In April of 1964, Americans read in their newspaper, "Far more important facts are that Premier Ben Bella, though very much a dictator, is not a communist." 1 month later, in May of 1964, Ben Bella was awarded the Lenin Peace Prize in Moscow. 2 months later, in July 1964, Communist Ben Bella declared, "We solemnly reply here that our socialism stems from Islam. We repeat before world opinion that we are not communists." After the communists have found some issue or point of difference upon which they can divide the people, get them fighting among themselves rather than their common enemy, the next step is to create the appearance of popular support for the communists' war of national liberation. They have been devastatingly successful thus far. Yet in one country after another, there have been alert, informed individuals who saw the signs recognized the patterns of conquest and raised their voices to warn the people. Against just such a contingency, the Communists developed the third phase of their blueprint for world domination: neutralize the opposition.
We can and must write in a language which sows among the masses hate, revulsion, and scorn toward those who disagree with us.
A Communist Party directive issued in 1943 reads,
Members and front organizations must continually embarrass, discredit, and degrade our critics. When obstructionists become too irritating, label them as fascist or Nazi or anti-Semitic. Constantly associate those who oppose us with those names which already have a bad smell. The association will, after enough repetition, become fact in the public mind.
What did they say? Hitler said, tell a lie long enough and it becomes the truth, right? You heard what he said. The longer you call these people these names, in the public's opinion, you know, these people start to believe, oh yeah, you must be a Nazi. I mean, think about it, right? They pulled this on the truckers from Canada, right? That were out there protesting, right? They were calling them white supremacists, Nazis, anti-vaxxers, you know, and I forget the other thing they were calling them. But I mean, you see it, you know, all over the place. So you see their method, and now you know where they're getting this from. You know who they studied and learned this from, and whose plan they're implementing.
In China, the formula worked well. The word landlord became almost an invective. Those who worked for the government were looked upon as grafters. The government under Chiang Kai-shek was reviled as an enemy of the people, a fascist tool of the ruling class. Those who refused to support the agrarian reformers were subject to surprise visits from roving guerrilla bands. The pattern was the same in Cuba. Those who were less than enthusiastic about Castro's reform were effectively branded as Batista followers. The man who spoke up against the revolt was labeled as a counter-revolutionary. Algerians who saw through the fraud and endeavored to warn the nation or their neighbors were vilified as extremists, colonialists, racists, fascists. Torture, death, and the fear of torture and death were also most effective weapons against those who might resist the tyrannical takeover. The number of atrocities committed in the name of freedom upon the Muslim people averaged nearly 20 per day for every day of every month for 7 years. The next step in the communist strategy is the most easily recognized, for it consists of the tactic of getting masses into motion, and thus precipitating mob violence. Master psychologists that they are, the communists know that once the masses are in the streets, it's not too difficult to convert an orderly demonstration into a full-scale riot. They know, too, that when rioting occurs, police and military forces of the government must move to restore law and order, and thus they have the first visible signs of revolution.
Riots, demonstrations, street battles, detachments of a revolutionary army. Such are the stages in the development of the popular uprising.
The official constitution and program of the Communist Party stated in 1921,
The Communist Party will educate and organize the working masses for mass strikes and mass demonstrations. It is through struggles that the working masses are prepared for the final conflict for power. As these strikes grow in number and intensity, they acquire political character through unavoidable collision and open combat with the capitalistic state. Mass action culminates in insurrection and civil war.
In 1964, a communist document taken from the Viet Cong stated,
Get the people out into the streets. Quarrels should be provoked. Youth groups are to be armed with knives and clubs, allegedly to protect themselves in a manufactured tension.
In China, as in all countries, the communist appeal was aimed primarily at students, young, idealistic intellectuals, most of whom came from wealthy families who could afford to send them to school. It was from this group that the young communist recruits came who later provided the leadership and backbone for the armed conflict to follow. In Cuba, leftist-oriented students were the vanguard of the organized street demonstrations. Once the masses were in motion, that tenuous line between demonstration and riot, between nonviolence and violence, was easily obliterated. As law enforcement officers sought to restore order, police brutality became the cry of the insurgents. Algeria was more of the same: rallies, demonstrations, marches, and the inevitable flare of violence. The invariable charges of police brutality were hurled as efforts were made to maintain law and order. When marches and demonstrations turn into riots in any country slated for takeover, the communists are then ready to implement the final stage of their blueprint for conquest. It takes only a handful of armed opportunists, criminals and savages to create the semblance of revolution.
Only insurrection can guarantee the victory of the revolution. The purpose of insurrection must be not only the complete destruction or removal of all local authorities and the replacement by new, but also the expulsion of the landlords and the seizure of their lands.
Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces had long been fighting the communist-inspired insurrectionists of Mao Zedong when the Japanese invaded the mainland of China. With the end of World War II and the defeat of the Japanese, the United States pressured Chiang into forming a coalition government with the communists. Through a coerced truce and enforced arms embargo, the U.S. disarmed more than 30 divisions of Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist troops. On the other hand, the Chinese communists fell heir to all the arms left by the defeated Japanese, and with the help of added armaments from Russia, Mao was soon able to ride in triumph throughout China and give 400 million Chinese agrarian reform, communist style. When it was time for the shooting to begin in Cuba, Fidel Castro received millions of dollars in cash and vast amounts of arms and ammunition from the Soviet Union and communist groups throughout the Western Hemisphere. At the crucial time in Castro's bid for power, the United States State Department declared an arms embargo against Batista's government, refusing to deliver even the arms that had already been paid for and were awaiting shipment. Yet, on the other hand, revolutionary sympathizers were delivering men, arms, and ammunition to Castro daily from the United States. In Algeria, Ben Bella's rebels were fighting their war of liberation with guns and ammunition sent to them through Tunisia and Morocco by the communist bloc countries. And just as the revolution was coming to a head, a slight change in the overall strategy was instituted. In 1958, France's President Charles de Gaulle came to Algeria, declaring with outstretched arms, "I have understood you. I declare that from this day forward, France considers that in the whole of Algeria there is only one category of inhabitants, that there are only Frenchmen in the full sense." De Gaulle called for the people to vote on the question of independence for Algeria, and the majority voted to remain French citizens, an integral part of France. De Gaulle said, 3.5 million men and women have cast their votes of confidence. This is a fact that commits France and Algeria to each other for all time. 2 years later, in 1960, the same French president, Charles de Gaulle, was heard to ridicule the Frenchization of the Algerians and to talk of an Algerian Algeria. It didn't take the leaders of the Army of Liberation long to change the talk of an Algerian Algeria into slogans demanding a Muslim Algeria. Ultimately,
And think about it, you see that stuff being done right now. You know, Obama had his thing, his slogan, what was it? Change will come, right? And then, what was the other guy? Biden, right? Biden, it's Biden-onomics, right? Like John Cena's Thugonomics, Bidenomics. So we're seeing the same thing being pulled off again here, you know. And the liberation will be, oh, we need to liberate the world from the United States because it's overreached with its, you know, its sanctions it pulls on everybody. It's overreached and it harmed too many nations and it's out of control. That's how they're going to feed it to the people, and then their people will buy it because they, you know, let's see, they've honestly suffered from sanctions that have been put upon them. You know, that's why you have the BRICS now, which I think is the fulfillment of, was it Ezekiel, like, was it 38? I believe it is. I might be wrong, 36, 37, or 38, one of them, where he speaks about the 10 nations that will come against her. Oh.
Revolutionary Ben Bella returned to Algeria and in due course established a regime of which he said, "We solemnly reply here that our socialism stems from Islam. We repeat before world opinion that we are not communists." And so it has been, with but minor variations in one country after another. Divide the people. Create the appearance of popular support. Neutralize the opposition. Precipitate mob violence. Create the semblance of a revolution. An accurate summary of Lenin's strategy for the conquest of the world is as follows.
First, we will take Eastern Europe. Next, the masses of Asia. Then we shall encircle the last bastion of capitalism, the United States of America. We will not have to attack. It will fall like overripe fruit into our hands.
By October of 1950, all of Eastern Europe was securely locked behind the Iron Curtain. By the summer of 1954, the greater part of Asia had fallen to the Kremlin's strategy and tactics. And each year, more nations lose their sovereignty to Marxist intrigues or degenerate into Soviet satellites as communism hastens to complete the encirclement of the last bastion of capitalism. And what of the United States? How goes the battle in the land of the free and the home of the brave? The communist plan for the conquest of the United States was explained to the American comrades by Moscow's agent Joseph Pogany, country by Stalin for the revolutionary movement. American Negro Problems was published in 1928 by Joseph Pogany using the alias John Pepper and carried the official communist line for America.
The Workers' Communist Party of America, in its fight against imperialism, must recognize clearly the tremendous revolutionary possibilities of the liberation movement of the Negro people. The Black Belt of the South, with its starving and pauperized Negro farmers and Negro agricultural working masses, with its Jim Crowism, its semi-feudal status, and its political system still bearing the earmarks of the period of slavery, constitutes virtually a colony within the body of the United States of America. The Workers' Communist Party of America puts forward correctly as its central slogan, abolition of the whole system of race discrimination, full racial, social, and political equality for the Negro people. But it is necessary to supplement the struggle for the full racial, social, and political equality of the Negroes with a struggle for their right of national self-determination. Self-determination means the right to establish their own state, to erect their own government if they choose to do so. The Negro Communists should emphasize in their propaganda the establishment of a Negro Soviet Republic.
In 1934, the communist writers James W. Ford and James S. Allen further defined the Soviet Negro Republic.
The actual extent of this new republic would in all probability be approximately the present area in which the Negroes constitute the majority of the population. In other words, it would be approximately the present plantation area. It would be certain to include such cities as Richmond and Norfolk, Virginia, Columbia and Charleston, South Carolina, Atlanta, Augusta, Savannah, and Macon, Georgia, Montgomery, Alabama, New Orleans and Shreveport, Louisiana, Little Rock, Arkansas, and Memphis, Tennessee.
These cities, and the cities which lie within their spheres of influence, became known in communist writings as the Black Belt of the South, and were to constitute the nucleus of a future Soviet republic. At the National Convention of the American Communist Party, held in New York City in June of 1940, James Ford, the Communist Party candidate for the Vice Presidency of the United States, said,
"For the Negro in the South, my people, the Negro people of America, have in the Communist Party their best defender, the unfailing champion of their cause. I accept its nomination for Vice President of the United States."
By this time, the communist champions of the Negro race had hidden the revolutionary ideas and slogans for a Soviet Negro Republic behind the humanitarian banners of jobs, security, civil rights, and peace. These humanistic issues were to provide the friction necessary to divide the American people and lay the groundwork for revolution.
I am Leonard Patterson. When I was a young man, only 23 years old, I joined the Communist Party. I was a member of the National Executive Committee of the American Young Communist League. In 1930, I was the official communist candidate for election to New York State Assembly. I knew Gus Hall and other top-ranking American communists very well because I trained with them at the Lenin University in Moscow. I joined the party because I honestly thought the communists were trying to help American Negroes. I broke away from the party when it became clear to me what the communists were really up to was to use the Negro people in this country as cannon fodder in a violent and bloody revolution aimed at the establishment of the American Soviet dictatorship. It was that simple, and it is still that simple today. Make no mistake about it. What is happening in the United States right now under the banner of civil rights is exactly what has happened in China, in Cuba, in Algeria, and many other places around the world.
I'm Julia Brown. For 9 years, I was a member of the Communist Party, serving as an undercover agent for the FBI. During that time, I learned that the communist conspiracy had been planning and working for years to bring violent revolution to America. It was to be a communist revolution, but the great majority of the American people would not be allowed to realize that until it had already happened. If all goes according to the communist blueprint, Americans will believe that the chaos and violence has something to do with civil rights. Our enemies were quick to find our weakest point for their attack. They knew that racial differences could provide them with an excellent wedge to divide our people. Their strategy simply has been to keep hammering on that wedge, to drive it deeper into our social structure, to open all wounds that have long since healed, and deliberately to create new ones wherever they can.
Now he acted like a good nigga for the white folks. But I tell you, I don't want to even be around no more good niggas. I'm with them good Negroes. That's what they call Rodriguez, a good Negro. I want to be with the bad niggas, because I know what's happening with the bad niggas. That's where I want to be. I want to be with the niggas. I want to be with the bad niggas that don't want to ride on the back of the bus no more. And this is what Elder Davis will call you. And the bad niggas is not going to work for $18 or $20. No, I want to be for the bad niggas who going to register and vote. I want to be for the bad niggas going to swim on any God's beach where water is flowing. I want to be with this type.
Lyndon Johnson is the biggest nigger lover in the United States.
Amen.
He may think that he can use his Justice Department with Bobby Kennedy at the head of it, and he may think that he can use J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI and the Army to force us white people here in St. Augustine and other parts of the nation to mix up with niggers. But if he sends troops in here and puts a bayonet behind every one of us, we still will not mix up with a bunch of black savages.
I'd like to say, in a real sense, not fellow freedom fighters, but fellow slaves. For we all are slaves, not only in this society, not only in this community, but all over this nation and all over the world. What you're doing here is very significant and it's very important.
Then you follow up your friends and acquaintances and ask them if they want to help put this fight over to save this country from the onslaught of integration. You know the system is they want to throw white children and colored children into the melting pot of integration, out of which will come a conglomerated, mulatto, mongrel class of people. Both races will be destroyed in such a movement. I, for one, under God, will die before I'll yield 1 inch to that kind of a movement in America.
And not only has the black man got a champion, they call him Martin Luther King, we call him Lucifer. If God has some champions of the white man, and you can name Connie Lynch as one of them. Today, tomorrow, and forever. And if this nigger thinks he can stir the niggers up, I'll also inform him that the white men can be stirred up to defend what is rightfully theirs.
And so,
now, isn't it something? One of the things that just stood out to me was like, how fickle all this was. And I mean, when I say fickle, I mean like, they're not even white people. They're not. They were. I mean, literally, they had to have someone. The gentleman that wrote the poem, "Go West, Young Man, and Grow Up with the Country." I can't think of his name. That dude had to literally write in the papers once slavery was supposed to be, abolished, he wrote that they should call themselves white people. And that they need to agree upon being white people. So, I mean, like that whole idea that keep the Negroes away from the white people. If you weren't under the impression that you were white, what would it have been?
now the seeds of dissension were sown among both the black and the white races. And inexorably, the people of the United States were being divided according to plan. Among the so-called downtrodden and oppressed, among the supposedly starving and pauperized Negroes, the enemy was referred to as Whitey, Mr. Charlie, the Man, and the Ofe. Phase 1 was well on its way. Now it was time to implement Phase 2. Create the appearance of popular support. Beguile the people of the United States and the world into believing the pious fraud that the civil rights uprising, led by a handful of agitators, was a popular movement of the whole Negro race in the United States.
Now, this doesn't mean that there isn't a legitimate need for the advancement of civil rights for many of our Negro citizens. Of course, there is a need there. Otherwise, communist agitators posing as civil rights leaders could never hope to enlist massive support for their schemes. The aspirations of Negroes for full equality were not created by communists, but they are used by communists in such a way that idealistic Americans of all races can be tricked into implementing the blueprint for revolution. Having been on the inside of the Communist Party, it's easy for me to recognize this revolutionary agitation in disguise. But the average American finds it's hard to believe that something as worthy and noble sounding as a civil rights movement could possibly be a communist maneuver.
Communism must be built with non-communist hands.
The revolutionary accepts reform in order to use it as a cover for his illegal work.
By concealing the true communist objectives behind appealing slogans and pretended humanitarian goals, the conspirators are able to dupe hundreds of uninformed opportunists and misguided idealists into supplying the non-communist hands needed in the overthrow of this republic. Thoroughly deceived, some of the Negroes cry for liberation through the slogan, "Freedom Now." The Democratic slogan, "One Man, One Vote," has gained wide acceptance. But perhaps the most popular slogan is "Venceremos," the rallying cry of the deluded peasants of Cuba, Haiti, and Venezuela. "Venceremos," we shall overcome, is now the rallying cry of the deluded peoples of the United States.
When I was studying communist tactics and strategy in Moscow, my instructors emphasized the importance of using honest grievances and popular slogans as a smokescreen to cover up the true nature of the revolution. We were taught how to use propaganda and arouse the emotion of the masses. We learned how to set one group against the other and to make them hate each other. We learned the necessity of having martyrs, and we were even told how to create our own martyrs if they did not imagine the result from the atmosphere of hatred. We were taught the importance of getting large masses of people into the street for marches and demonstrations. And finally, we were instructed in ways to take off riots and make them spread and to keep them going. When I returned to the United States, I was immediately given practical training. I participated in so-called nonviolent demonstrations that were deliberately calculated to irritate white people into violence against us. I personally was in charge of organizing a march on Washington to dramatize the Scottsboro Boys case. In New York, about 1935, a Negro boy was reported killed by the owner of a store while in the act of stealing some merchandise. Communist Party headquarters decided to make a march out of the boy. So we went right to work, putting out handbills and holding open air meetings. In less than a half hour after we started, there was a race riot at 125th Street, complete with smashing windows of white storekeepers, looting and all the rest. I'm not speaking of things I read about. These are things I personally participated in.
So did any of that stuff sound familiar, fresh, new in your mind? A young boy was killed, right? And what that lead to? Riots, right? Looting, smashing of windows, right? The whole thing was organized. So when you look at Black Lives Matter and the way that they function, after every killing of one of our own people or a person that looks like us, now you know where that comes from. It's communism with the end goal that it would bring about socialism. So I'm gonna stop it here. Like I said, I thought this video was really good. Just been, I don't know why, just been reluctant to do a video on it, and I just felt something nagging at me. So I don't want to feel disobedient anymore. I'm like, all right, I'll do it. And here it is. Like I said, I'll leave the whole video in the description box so you can watch it all. But I thought right there, every last step, we've seen it before our very eyes. Now we know what we're looking at. So, and oh, the last thing I wanted to say. They keep saying non-communist hands need to deal with this. Let's not forget who benefited from civil rights being passed. The Jews, right? And why do I say that? And I remember Judge Joe Brown in one of his interviews, he said, but he never told you where to find it, and that's the problem. But he said there's a law that whatever you could do to a Negro, you could do to a Jew. So they would want to have these, passed so they could have civil rights as well as the Negro people. And remember, Martin Luther King was up there rubbing shoulders with the Rockefellers, being funded by them, who claimed to be a Jewish family. I remember the bombs that took place in Atlanta at the Negro church. And they said that at the Jewish mosque there was bombs planted, but they never went off. So